Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, the Maryland General Assembly just completed an historic special session and is about to reconvene for 2008. Jamie Raskin chats with State Senate colleague Ulysses Currie about what's been accomplished and what remains to be done. We've got the extraordinary story of Ned Seligman, day 1 in the dentist's chair, day 3 in a coma, 1 month later a double amputee due to the MRSA superbug.
I think it was sort of the laughter of fate, so to speak, that he lived in Africa all these years and he came here and got an MRSA sepsis.
NIH infectious diseases specialist Dr. John Powers joins us to talk about how worried we should be about MRSA and what should be done about it. Also, Reuben Jackson reviews a collection of poetry by Islamic detainees on Guantanamo. Artist Muriel Hasbin traces her family's migrations from Palestine to El Salvador to the U.S. Poet Kyle Dargan offers an Autumnal Divination and Christmas Russian style with the choral group Svettilon. On the Coffee House.
Hello, welcome to the Forum at the Coffee House. The Maryland General Assembly completed in November an historic special session which closed a $1.7 billion budget deficit by increasing a range of taxes. It also expanded potential health insurance coverage to more than 100,000 Marylanders, invested in Chesapeake Bay cleanup, and put a referendum on slot machines on the November 2008 ballot. Many observers consider the results a huge victory for Governor Martin O'Malley, who went into the contentious 3-week session without a deal worked out in advance on key issues. But the session's also been criticized from the right and from the left, both from within and outside the General Assembly, for particular controversial components of the package. To help us sort out what happened and to analyze what it will mean for the upcoming session and for Maryland politics, I will be joined by my colleague, the distinguished chairman of the Maryland Senate Budget and Tax Committee, Ulysses Currie, Democrat of Prince George's County. Welcome to the Coffee House, Senator Currie.
Thank you, Senator Raskin. It's great to be your guest.
Well, it's great to see you, and you seem much better rested than when I saw you last.
No, it was 3 o'clock, I think.
In the morning.
In the morning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was quite a few weeks we had there.
Sure.
So I want you to help us analyze what took place, but we got to start with what the problem was. Where did this massive structural budget deficit come from in Maryland?
Came from 3 places. One, in 98, we did a tax cut, a 10% tax cut. In 2000, there was collapse of the dot-com market, and then we passed the legislation that would fund K-12 education called Bridge to Excellence.
The Thornton Plan.
The Thornton Plan.
Yeah.
So those 3 areas.
So we had declining revenues from the tax
Correct.
cut and from the implosion of the dot-coms, and then we had rising expenditures because of the public's investment and the General Assembly's investment in public schools, which is what people wanted. Okay, and so we called it a structural budget deficit because there was no way we were really going to cut our way out of it without going back on the commitment we had made.
And we call it structurally because spending is growing faster than revenues.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So the package that we came up with, it had different components. Tell us about the sales tax part, the income tax, the corporate tax.
There were several personal income, sales tax, corporate, cigarette tax, titling tax on gasoline, and I said cigarette tax.
Okay. Now, one reason progressives were not thrilled with the outcome, although most went along with it, was because of the sales tax. They felt as if we went from 5 cents to 6 cents with a 1% increase, which seems like a simple and easy thing to do. But its overall effect is a regressive effect because working class people spend almost all of their money just surviving, whereas wealthy people can save. And everybody pays the same rate.
Sure.
But why was it so easy for us to adopt the sales tax increase?
I think you were correct. I think it was easy because the people, it's regressive, and the people who it hits the hardest probably don't have the wherewithal to influence legislators as do people of wealth or the middle income.
And on the income tax, the governor came in with a somewhat higher proposal than where
Sure.
the General Assembly ended up. 5.5% was
Correct.
the rate at the highest level. We certainly heard from wealthier people
Sure we did.
about that. Do you think it was a fair compromise that was reached?
I think it was a fair compromise that was reached, because if we go back to the sales tax, although it's regressive, we have the earned income tax credit, which means that people making $30,000 or less pay no taxes at all. So I think it balanced out the regressivity of the sales tax. We probably would have liked to done more with the with services, but we were unable to do that.
And there was an increase in personal exemptions as well.
There were increasing personal exemptions as well.
Well, let's talk about the service sector for a
Sure.
second. Because my analysis was, we've got an industrial age tax system.
Correct.
I mean, we're taxing manufacturing, but the booming sector of our economy is services.
Correct.
And that's the growing part, and that may be the dominant part now. And there are no taxes there. And yet, instead of doing a kind of holistic, systematic approach to say, well, maybe we need a modest tax on all services, it was almost like we spun a roulette wheel and said, well, should it be the landscapers, should it be the engineers, should it be the lawyers, the accountants, and it ended up on the computer service professionals.
I think in your introduction you said we went into the session without having developed some consensus, without having done any work to put the pieces together. And I think trying to tax sales services was a victim of that process, because we were not able to coalesce behind any of the services, or we tried and they would not stick and we would pull them off.
Yeah, and so it seems a bit random and arbitrary.
That's correct. That's correct.
That's where it ended up. All right, so there was a 1% increase in the corporate tax.
1 1/4.
1 1/4 increase in the corporate tax, and we closed a corporate loophole.
We did close the corporate loophole.
Yeah.
It's called controlling interest. Now the large malls, when you and I sell our home, individual homes, we have to pay transfer tax. Now the large malls were not required to pay transfer tax. So we closed that loophole.
Yeah. All right, so you're chairman of the powerful, perhaps the most powerful committee in the Senate, the Budget and Tax Committee. You've represented Prince George's County for 21 years. What grade would you give us in terms of the work that we did in coming up with this budget package?
I think I'd give us an A+, Professor. I know you were great on the curve.
Yeah, that's liberal grading policy,
Right.
appropriate. Yeah.
I think you have to remember we had not raised taxes since 91 or 92.
Yeah.
So under Glendon 8 years and the Ehrlich 4 years, that's 12 years. We had not raised any taxes at all. Right. So to come in within 3 weeks without preparation, without having work, and do what we did to close the deficit, I think is commendable.
Right, and certainly there can be amendments and tweaks made to things that are kind of sticking out in different ways. All right, let's talk about slot machines, because I was delighted to follow your leadership on budget policy on most things. I think that the slot machines is one place where you and I voted differently. I voted against the slots. What do you think ultimately the best argument is for slot machines? What moved you?
I think that if you go to Delaware Park, if you go to Atlantic City, if you go to West Virginia, you see Maryland citizens there playing slots. $800 million leave the state each year going to those 3 states. And
so we want to capture the income here.
We want to capture the income. We want to capture the income.
And that argument would move me a lot more if I felt that we weren't going to induce tens of thousands of more people to start playing slot machines.
Correct.
And what I'm afraid of is really the social costs of it, because the studies that I've seen have shown, rising divorce, rising bankruptcy, rising gambling addiction, and crime and corruption. I mean, are we able to avoid that fate? Because when people say to me, well, what about Delaware and New Jersey and West Virginia? I say, hey, I like Maryland. I like what we've got. We've got high tech, we've got biotech, we've got life sciences. We've got a lot of things they don't have. Why don't we let them have something that we don't have?
If you're going to Baltimore City, where the median income is around $30,000 a year, and poverty is just significant poverty, I believe strongly we have to spend more money on education, especially higher education, especially community college. If you go to Montgomery County Community College, it's bubbling at the seam. You can't get in there.
Yeah.
That's not the case in Baltimore City. So we must come up with revenues in order, I believe, to help eradicate poverty. And I argue that if our citizens play in slots, why not use slots?
Right, and you make the fair point, or you've made the fair point to me before, that, look, if people were more willing to pay taxes, we wouldn't need to go down that road.
That's correct.
But people don't want to pay taxes. And on that point, I want to ask you about a little theory I have. You know, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, nobody likes paying taxes, but I do, he said, because it's the price that I pay for civilization.
Sure.
But I think that we're not getting a lot of civilization back from our federal tax dollars.
Correct.
And people don't like paying it because the bridges are collapsing from Minnesota all over the country. Hurricane Katrina demonstrated a government that was ignoring the emergency needs of the people, not meeting the needs of the people. And then we've got the Iraq War. We're spending hand over fist for a dangerous, reckless war, the worst foreign policy mistake of American history, right? And so people are mad about that, and yet the conservative talk show hosts were taking it out on the state government. I mean, we're mandated to have a balanced budget. Everybody knows exactly where our money's going, and it's going for schools, it's going for health care, it's going for public safety, for environmental protection. And they turned it against us, the Republicans.
No Child Left Behind, special education. Many of the federal mandates that at the state that we're required to fund, we're required by the federal government to fund those programs, and the money don't follow the program is why we are have the difficulties.
There are all these unfunded mandates,
all these
like No Child Left Behind.
Like No Child Left Behind.
Which I always say is a better description of their military recruitment policy than it is of their educational agenda.
Sure.
And we know a lot of teachers are leaving the profession because they can't stand just teaching to the test all day long. Correct. And that's the culture that they've created there. All right, so headed back to Annapolis for the new session. We balanced the budget, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of money there for big new investments, and we got 700,000 uninsured people in the health system. Are we going to be able to deal with that?
I think hopefully when we go back to Annapolis, there will be patience. We'll be patient for a couple of years. We know that this economy now is not doing well. It'll probably take another 2 years for the economy to turn around. Slots, assuming that the referendum passed and we get slots, it'll be about 2 years before slots start bringing in money. And that money will go towards higher education. It will go towards roads and school construction.
You think the slots referendum will pass in November of 2008?
I have my doubts. Yeah, I have with Montgomery County, Prince George's County, I feel strongly oppose slots. And it's going to be very difficult without the two major counties in our population.
Let me ask you a general question about budget, because you've been through so many of these budget cycles. I feel like the politics and the economics are sort of at odds, because when times are really flush, that's when we should be saving the money for the rainy days, either saving it or stocking it away somehow. But the tendency among politicians is either spend it or give it back to people with tax cuts. Then we get into a period like now, and there's no money there.
That's correct.
And then we raise taxes, but we're in a recessionary period. It's not great to raise taxes during we might be moving into a recession, right?
You're correct. And there's ebb and flow in the economy. Every 3 or 4 years, we're going to go into a recession. And as you say, during the times of when we're flush with dollars, why not set that money aside? Why not set aside, say, $2 billion in our rainy day fund, a dedicated purpose account, for these times when we know the economy is going to go down?
So we got to impose some fiscal restraint.
We have to
both sides of the aisle.
That's correct. That's correct.
All right, let me ask you about the presidential contest. Well, I've got you here, Senator Currie, because I know you've been a key activist for Senator Obama. I'm backing Senator Obama. I'm interested in what you think about this surge in his campaign that's apparently taking place in Iowa and different parts of the country. A lot of people thought he would never be able to catch up with Hillary Clinton. What's going on?
I don't know. I think he struck a chord in the American public, and this is for me, the most exciting thing that I've seen happen in this country, that here you have a young man who is fairly young. He's African American, and when you see the audiences that flock into him and where he is in the polls now, and it's just amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you have a sense about what's happening in Maryland? I mean, are we a state, because of our timing in the primary process, that will just follow along with whatever's happening, or do you think that we sort of have a will of our own when it comes to presidential politics?
I think we'll have a will of our own. I believe Obama will win in Maryland.
Yeah.
Of course, Senator Clinton has very strong support here. She has the governor and she has many of the senators who support her. But I think with the momentum, if Obama comes out of our way, if he goes to South Carolina and wins there, I think he comes here with a lot of momentum.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I should tell a little secret, which is you and I get the chance to play chess when we're in Annapolis, and both of us are huge chess enthusiasts. But you've actually taken that to a different level in terms of trying to get chess going in schools and juvenile facilities and so on. What's your thinking about, chess and the strategic thinking process and what it does for young people?
I think that, again, chess, I was a principal, I was a teacher. I think chess will teach you every skill that a child needs today in terms of thinking, in terms of reasoning, in terms of inference, organizational skills, planning skills. Chess will teach you all of those skills. And if you look at this, especially somewhere in our urban area, some of the challenges that our young people are having, I think chess would go a long ways towards filling that gap.
Yeah. Well, maybe our friends at Coffee House will invite us to come back on sometime and talk in more detail about your plans for putting a chess set in every classroom and in every kid's desk,
And hopefully they would be as good as you are in playing chess.
So, we should tell people that you beat me one night, which was the absolute lowest night of the special session.
I think we should also tell people that you were once the top chess player in Montgomery County.
For like 8 and under or something like that. So
that's even more remarkable.
That's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Senator Currie, are you excited about going back to Annapolis, having gotten the big budget problems out of the way?
Not yet, because I think the 3 weeks took a lot out of us, especially on the Budget and Taxation Committee, because we had every piece of the legislation, which about 6 or 7. So I think I'm not yet ready to go back to Annapolis.
Yeah. All right. Well, we thank you for your leadership through this process and your distinguished advocacy for the people of Prince George's County for so many decades. It is an honor to serve with you. And, it seems that government always has money for things we don't need, like the Iraq War and bridges to nowhere rather than the bridges to somewhere, which seem to be collapsing all around us. The Maryland General Assembly worked hard to close the state budget deficit, and now is the challenge of meeting the many needs of our people in one of America's wealthiest states. I'm Senator Jamie Raskin, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
A spasm wakes the prophet, his body's own proclamation stuttering within his quadricep. He dresses in a bedsheet only, then sails downstairs onto the streets. A new dance approaches. He testifies to a plaster bucket drummer who cannot spare an ear. Then for all he sings, Georgia Avenue, our new dance arrives, as heads poke from buildings, begging proof of a new dance. Show us this new dance. Show us. The prophet has only his legs ache to share, truth yet to come. Until then, the people shout down his revelatory decibels, close windows, and return to worshiping their talking screens. Desperate, the prophet enters the nickel and dime, pilfers cooking spray, matches, curly wigs. The first wig he saturates and sets a flame atop his skull while sprinting towards WHUR like the ghost of black consumption. With the second, he streaks across U Street like the ghost of chocolate past. He weaves flames from the remaining wig through the hill's saturation of ghost, finally extinguishing his mission in the Anacasia's sullied arms, his lungs still smoldering. Soon, red and blue's bright syncopation, fingers searing against triggers, Secret Service, Metro PD, FBI, Hill PD, all warring over jurisdiction and whose right it is to end what is already done. One finger flinches. A swarm of metal besets the prophet, and he dances along the river, an elegant ferocity in each bullet dodge. 2 shots pierced his leg, the muscle that woke him, carried his burning constellation across the town. As autopsy would reveal, a heartbeat in his thigh. As he falls, shock arrests his posture, arms cast up as if such fear could be rapture or such dancing could be given terror's name. From the riverbanks, those who followed the flames mumble, "Witness, witness." Licked by memory, the capital cannot still a tremble.
My name is Ned Seligman, born in San Francisco in 1947, the middle son of Joe and Peggy Seligman. I spent my childhood up until 13 in San Francisco, then went east to boarding school and to college. And at the end of that, in the late 60s, I went into the Peace Corps to what is now called Burkina Faso.
Ned remained in Africa with a number of nonprofit service organizations. In 1993, he returned to the Peace Corps as country director for Sao Tome, off the coast of West Africa. With only 140,000 people, Sao Tome is largely ignored by major development organizations. So, in 1998, Ned formed his own non-governmental organization there, Step Up.
We do health, we do rural development, we do education. Most of it is really training.
There are plenty of needs. Sao Tome is impoverished and health conditions are marginal, even for affluent Westerners residing there.
I've had probably 10 bouts of malaria, some relatively minor, others quite serious, but with proper care you survive, no problem.
In late June 2004, Ned made his annual pilgrimage back to the U.S.
Well, I did what I always do, which is see family and friends and go to the doctor.
And his San Francisco dentist.
And 2 days later, I was complaining to my mother of feeling odd or weak or whatever. And she recommended that I go to the clinic, a local clinic, and I did, and they, did what clinics do. They took my temperature and said, take 2 aspirin and go to bed.
But aspirin and a night of sleep didn't do the trick.
I don't really remember the day that I went to the hospital. It's all mixed in with my unconsciousness.
I first learned about Ned's condition via his mother. She had called me to tell me that Ned was feeling unwell, had had a headache and a temperature. And I asked her to give me the phone so I could speak to him, and he was unable to even take the phone and converse.
All I know is Mom said I was sitting around in the living room, and next thing she knew, she came in and I was keeled over. The next thing I remember after a month approximately being in a coma was awakening in a hospital room and finding my life turned upside down.
Ned was rushed by ambulance to the emergency room at Marin County Hospital.
And by the time I saw him, he had already become incoherent and then nonverbal. And then he became combative. So he really evolved very quickly. It's a dogma in medicine that when somebody comes from overseas, from a place like Africa, and has delirium and everything, you have to think about malaria. It's the first thing that it's up there in the differential diagnosis.
Ned was quickly put on a number of antibiotics, including vancomycin.
Vancomycin was chosen empirically because we had a high suspicion of encephalitis or meningitis.
Ned fell into a coma, and his condition continued to spiral downhill.
On the day of admission, when I went to see Ned at Marin, it was evident that his peripheries had been compromised in their blood supply at that time. His toes, his ankles, lower legs, and all his fingers were blue, cold, and obviously had no circulation.
And if you had asked me at the bedside, do you suspect methicillin-resistant staph aureus, I wouldn't have. He hadn't been in a nursing home or in a hospital, or he hadn't had, as far as you could tell. So there was nothing to suggest why he would have a methicillin-resistant staph aureus.
The appearance of MRSA initially was limited to hospitals, probably because of the intensive antibiotic use that occurred in hospitals, and with the particular type of antibiotic that would offer these strains an advantage in that antibiotic environment. So in the 1940s and 1950s, penicillin was increasingly used.
The ability of penicillin to stave off death in patients who would otherwise have died of fatal conditions like staph septicemia or pneumonia quickly gave penicillin the accolade of miracle drug.
And by the mid-1950s, resistance had occurred to the point that strains could not be reliably managed with the penicillin. Staph aureus is primarily an organism of humans. It colonizes humans. This colonization begins early at birth. It is asymptomatic and completely silent, therefore. So it's part of the normal flora that we acquire. And if you look at Staph aureus infections broadly, you can trace the organism to the nose in about 80% of the cases. So the thinking is that the organism is hanging around, but if there's a portal of entry, that is a break in the skin, then it can colonize that portal of entry, and then it gains a foothold and establishes an invasive or local infection.
Ned did undergo a skin biopsy in Washington 6 weeks prior to his coming to Marin. However, he also underwent teeth cleaning 2 days prior to his becoming unwell. It is entirely possible that the teeth cleaning could have precipitated infection, septicemia, and endocarditis with MRSA.
You never come out of a tooth or a mouth cleaning without some blood, at least I don't. And somehow staph probably invaded or infected some of these little wounds and got into the bloodstream.
Dental procedures per se are not a risk factor for Staph aureus. Could it? Certainly it could. Could something be introduced at day 1 and cause infection at day 3? It certainly could.
At some point in time, different things arose, that it was clear that without a more definitive solution, they would not go away. Earlier on, parts of his feet and digits did manifest some gangrene. And initially, it was mostly dry, but some parts of it did become wet. And we really couldn't clear it in any way. At some point, despite many local therapies, it became clear that those parts had to go.
The need and the question of amputation became more evident after failed conservative treatment to try and preserve tissue, which would have been probably a month into the hospital course. And it was evident at that time that conservative measures were not successful.
When they take off a piece, in other words, they still have to cut through a piece that's still alive, because the leading edge has to be alive. So it is associated with cutting into tissue, creating inflammation in the tissue, creating a reaction. In other words, it's not like cutting wood, so they don't bounce back so quickly.
After 1 month in a coma, Ned awakened to discover that his legs were amputated below the knees, and the ends of his fingers had been surgically removed. But the vancomycin given to treat possible meningitis ultimately saved his life.
The drugs of choice for treating methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, or MRSA, in the hospital it still is vancomycin. This is the time-honored antibiotic. There are problems with vancomycin because of resistance now becoming an issue, and it is not as efficacious as the beta-lactam class. There have been a series of new antibiotics that are under development or recently introduced that can be used, but vancomycin, I think, remains the drug of choice.
It totally stands what is normal logic on its head, where if the assumption is you go to Africa and you're exposed to every killer disease that exists, and yeah, you are exposed to some, but it's hardly as bad as the average imagination portrays it. But then you come back to a supposedly sanitary, health-conscious nation where everything is supposed to work, and you get hit with deadly disease.
I think it was sort of the laughter of fate, so to speak, that he lived in Africa all these years, and he came here and got an MRSA sepsis. And I wish him all the well.
Ned's back in Sao Tome, but his life is irrevocably changed.
Well, everything is slowed down considerably. You don't just wake up in the morning and run into the bathroom and wash your face and brush your teeth. All of that takes 20 minutes. Before the staph hit, I was much more interested in the sensual parts, like eating, drinking, having fun. I no longer really care about that. Yeah, sure, I wish it didn't ever happen, but it's just like old age. Things happen and you deal with them.
Nunca vou parar. Às vezes ando de olhos entreabertos. Não sei se isso é esperto, não consigo precisar. Desse meu jeito enxergo bem mais longe. Os olhos não se molham, tudo posso avistar.
Welcome to In Sickness and in Health at the Coffee House, where we'll continue to consider the superbug MRSA. It's suddenly all over the news, but how is it communicated? How can it be prevented, contained, and defeated, or can it? We ask one of the country's leading infectious diseases specialists, Dr. John Powers of the National Institutes of Health. John, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for inviting me.
We just saw a story about Ned Seligman. He had double amputation as a result of MRSA. How common is his situation in the context of MRSA infections?
When you look at it in terms of probability of someone having this serious an infection, it's actually relatively uncommon. About 3/4 of people, even with this kind of new organism that we're seeing, have minor skin infections that, in fact, may resolve all by themselves. It looks like skin abscesses may resolve just with lancing of the abscess. So this is a fairly uncommon thing to actually have happen. Why it happens isn't very clear. It's probably a combination of the organism, but also the person who gets it, whether their immune system can handle it, and that determines what happens to them in the end.
So staph infection isn't typically a life-threatening infection?
Not usually. Most people, it can range anything from a small pimple to very common skin infection called impetigo that children get, where they get a crusting on their face, all the way up to very serious infections like pneumonia and meningitis.
Now, MRSA is a resistant form of an infection, resistant to typical antibiotics. How do you tell the difference between, how do you know when an infection is resistant to antibiotics and when it isn't?
This, I thought, was an important part of Ned's story, too, in that he went to a physician first and was given aspirin and sent home. And it really, that's not that the physician was wrong, but it really highlights the difficulty that we have making appropriate diagnoses in this area. So to actually find out what a person has and whether it's resistant or not requires culturing the organism from some site in the body and then figuring out whether it's then resistant on a culture plate. And that may take up to 24 to 48 hours. In the meantime, you're guessing what the person has.
In Ned's case, another thing that was rather unusual, I think, is the fact that accidentally, inadvertently, they made the right decision about what kind of treatment to use. Typically, if somebody comes in with an infection, they're not going to go first to vancomycin, are they? Because it's not a strong antibiotic.
Well, it's ironic that they made that decision because of another organism they were worried about. When someone comes in and isn't thinking properly, and you think about meningitis, what people are concerned about is resistant Streptococcus pneumoniae, which people treat with vancomycin. So in a way, resistance caused him to get the right thing, even though it was for not the organism that he actually turned out to have.
Now, people use the term superbug. We've used it on this show in regards to MRSA and certain other infections. Is this kind of media overkill, the term, or are we facing superbugs that are really something that we should be scared of?
I think when you think about it, a little unsuspecting staph does not want to kill the person that it's riding on. Its job is to multiply and make other staph, and if it kills its host, it's not doing what it wants to do either. So these organisms, actually, we live symbiotically with them perfectly well. And in fact, there's a great article in Newsweek about this last month where it talks about how killing off the normal organisms on your body may actually be harmful to you. So it's when these organisms get in the wrong place, in the wrong person. So for instance, someone else who didn't have Ned's immune system might have done quite well and might have been okay. So it really is a combination of things. And what happens is that these really tragic stories are the ones that we hear about the most. So it's sort of the tip of the iceberg, but we talk about it a lot. Rightfully so. It's a very tragic case.
Dr. Chambers, who we saw in this story, was talking about how hospitals are an incubator, as it were, for resistant forms of infections, because there are so many antibiotics flowing around in hospitals that bacteria develop resistance in order to survive. A few mutate, survive the onslaught of antibiotics. Those are the ones that reproduce, and then the antibiotics aren't effective in treating them. Are we in danger of creating strains of bacteria of infection that aren't going to be treatable?
It's interesting. All of the studies that look at this almost universally show that having received an antibiotic in the past is one of the risk factors to then either be carrying or get infected with a resistant organism. When you talk about antibiotics getting used a lot in the hospital, it's actually the intensity of the antibiotics. Everybody's crowded together and getting them. But the vast majority of antibiotics are actually used out in the community for minor illnesses, and an even greater amount of antibiotics are used in food animals. So when we talk overall usage of antibiotics, they're being used in a lot of places. It's just in the hospital that probably people are crowded together the most. The reason why that's important is that this new kind of staph, and maybe that was the type that Ned had, people actually think may have been bred out in the community. And now it's starting to get into the hospital. So these things are now mixing together. It used to be most of these organisms were in the hospital and they'd be carried outside the hospital by people who were there. Now it looks like it may be going the other way. And in fact, it's so mixed up now that you can get a community infection in the hospital or a hospital infection in the community.
You mentioned also the presence in the feed supply of antibiotics. Talk about that.
Mm-hmm. So the issue is that, at least in food-producing animals, the use of antibiotics in them may result in resistant bacteria that doesn't harm the animal at all. They just carry it. And when the animal is slaughtered, it then can carry that organism on it. And even though we do our best to cook them, etc., it may then be transmitted to people and either cause foodborne illness, or in certain instances there have been organisms that have been transmitted from the gut of, say, a chicken. A person eats them, it gets into your intestine, spreads somewhere else, and causes a non-foodborne illness. For instance, in France, urinary tract infections have been found in women that were caused by organisms that they could trace the chickens.
So that's one way that antibiotic resistance develops in the human population. What are some of the other ways?
Mm-hmm. The other is all the antibiotics that we use. And a lot of the times we use antibiotics for things we don't need them for. And one way is where we take antibiotics for a bacterial infection when in fact what we have is a viral infection. Most of the upper respiratory tract infections, the sniffles, the colds that we get, won't respond to antibiotics because they're not caused by a bacteria. The other issue is there are bacterial infections, but they still may not respond to an antibiotic. And by respond, I mean that more people would get better with the antibiotic than if their own immune system took care of it on their own. And it's interesting that there was just a recent article in September of actually testing antibiotics versus a placebo in skin infections, particularly abscesses. And in that study, the majority of people had methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, and 90% of the people on placebo got better, and 84% of the people who got the drug got better. So if that's the case, giving antibiotics in that setting would actually be breeding the very problem that we're trying to stop. The reason why folks want to give antibiotics, though, is they're afraid something bad might happen to someone if they don't give the antibiotic, that someone like Ned would start off with a minor skin infection and go on to get something worse. The problem with that thinking is that, first of all, we don't have any evidence that antibiotics can actually prevent those serious complications from occurring, but it's really a public health question.
You're talking about prophylactic use.
Prophylactically, right. So, but we don't know that perhaps if we prevented one case out of 1 million, perhaps we'd be causing more problems by giving antibiotics in that setting. For instance, from the direct side effects of the antibiotics, or what's the balance between breeding these organisms versus actually preventing the problem? So that's something we need more research to actually answer those questions.
And, when I think about this from a global standpoint, I say, yeah, I really get what you're saying. And then from a family standpoint, my family was afflicted with MRSA. 3 out of 4 of us had it. I ended up having to go in the hospital and have surgery to have an infection removed, and then was on vancomycin for 3-4 days. Had you asked me at that time, are you prepared to sacrifice for the good of the society by not taking antibiotics, because every time somebody uses antibiotics it creates more resistance in the population? I would have probably said no.
Yeah, that's not an argument that goes over very well with people. And actually, I think the better way to explain it to people is we want to give you something that's going to help your infection go away faster than if we had given you nothing. If we give you something that's not effective, regardless of the resistance problem, these drugs also have direct adverse events in terms of serious allergic reactions, etc. And one way I explain it to people, those are always portrayed as rare. But suppose something happens 1 in 10,000. I always tell folks, well, line up 10,000 people against the wall and point to me to the one person who's going to get it. We don't know. Could be me, could be you. So we need better research to actually tell us when these things are effective. The other issue is we want to do something that actually is helpful for people. So in those settings, what we need to know is, are there things that we can use preventively? So for instance, if somebody prevents with a skin infection and we're worried about it coming back, we should actually study things in that setting for prevention to show, can we use these things to prevent things from coming back? The other issue is that we've always thought of this as an antibiotic problem, and perhaps there are other interventions we can use besides antibiotics that we can study. So for instance, these organisms make what's called a biofilm. It's like a Star Trek shield that protects these organisms from antibiotics even getting near them. So perhaps things that break down this shield may either help antibiotics work better or prevent the infections all by themselves without having to use antibiotics. Antibiotics are kind of like you only have so many bullets in the gun. And if you use them for prevention, then when you need to use them when someone's sick, they may not work anymore.
Now, I know your concern isn't just when somebody's sick, it's the type of sickness too. Just for full disclosure, I've had an association with John in the past when he worked at FDA in my job with the Government Accountability Project. And In that capacity, when you were at FDA, you were very concerned that the agency was finding drugs to be efficacious when you weren't finding evidence that they were really working, that they were being given for upper respiratory infections that were potentially self-resolving, and there was no strong evidence as far as you could see that they were really working, but they were causing resistance.
Right, so we ended up causing the problem we were actually trying to fix. So if you look at a problem like bronchitis, where people just have a cough after they've had either a viral infection or some of those have secondary bacterial infections on top of them. There have been 14 studies that compared an antibiotic to a placebo in that setting. 10 of those 14 studies failed to show evidence that the antibiotics were helpful in that setting. Now, that doesn't mean that antibiotics aren't effective. It could be that those trials were so flawed that we really couldn't pick out the effective antibiotics in that setting. Whatever the case may be, that requires better trials. But the FDA has approved 64 different new drug applications, which is what they call an application from a drug sponsor, based on trials comparing drug A to drug B, when drug A wasn't really shown to be any better than a placebo. So in that setting, without that knowledge, we're actually causing the very problem of resistance that we're trying to fix. So for instance, we were talking about antibiotic use in the hospital. There's about 160,000 cases a year of pneumonia that people get in the hospital. But there's about 24 million prescriptions written a year for sinus infections, about 27 million a year for ear infections, and a similar number for bronchitis. Those three reasons are some of the major reasons people get antibiotics, and it dwarfs what's done in the hospital. It's spread out more in the community, so it's not as dense. But when you think about the overall problem, that's a big contribution to the issue.
It was my understanding that there was greater recognition that we are abusing antibiotics and that we're going to ruin a good thing if we continue to do that. But in fact, the prescription record isn't supportive of that, is it?
So it does. What some colleagues of mine and myself at the FDA, we actually looked at the usage of antibiotics in this regard. The overall prescription writing has gone down. And most of that's been for older antibiotics. And the irony is that newer antibiotics, which actually are more powerful at knocking out your own normal bacteria, have gone up about 300% in the meantime. So yes, we're getting the message across, but not in its entirety. The other issue is, I think you answered the question already, it's people say, that's somebody else's problem. When I'm sick, I want an antibiotic, even if they're not really sure whether it's going to be effective or not. And I think that's an educational issue. Antibiotics have always been portrayed as life-saving drugs, and they certainly are in Ned's case when you have a serious infection. I think people don't realize that the benefits of actually taking these antibiotics in certain settings aren't that great. I was at a meeting today where people were talking about diarrhea, infectious diarrhea, and in the military. And most of the soldiers who had diarrhea, 80% of them didn't bother to go to the clinic. And when asked why, they said, it's not bothering me that much, it goes away by itself. So I think they
We're going to have
realized.
to go away by ourselves now, I'm afraid, because we've run out of time. But many thanks to infectious diseases expert Dr. John Powers for helping us to put the MRSA scare and the very real danger of growing antibiotic resistance into context. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been In Sickness and in Health.
The 22 poems included in Poems from Guantanamo were written by detainees held in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. After arduous negotiations with the Pentagon, these poems were edited and translated by Mark Falkoff, who also served as an attorney for the 17 writers included in the anthology, and published by the University of Iowa Press. No matter where one stands on the question of the treatment of these detainees, poems such as Sheikh Abdul Rahim Muslim Dost's simple but moving Cup Poem number 1, in which he asks, "What kind of spring is this, where there are no flowers and the air is filled with a miserable smell?" are, like most of the poems in Guantanamo, filled with an unshakable emotional and visual immediacy. Cup transports us to a place far more real and disturbing than the stories we might casually scan in the morning paper, as does 14-year-old Muhammad El-Gorani's first poem of my life, in which he calmly and defiantly addresses those who worship petty cash. By contrast, Ibrahim el-Rubaish's Ode to the Seas, long, lilting lines successfully approximate its subject's beauty and power, though ironically its freedom only serves to remind the poet of his imprisonment. These are not poems written by men of leisure. They are portraits of a distant yet not so distant world. When reading poems from Guantanamo, it's difficult not to think of Ezra Pound's oft-quoted definition of poetry, news that stays news. The 22 poems from Guantanamo provide thought-provoking perspectives and unforgettable headlines. I'm Reuben Jackson, and this has been Writer's Block.
Aquí está el barco ya terminado. Y cuando salíamos del colegio de Santa Cecilia, que ya